Oddio mi na
Hello, 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 everyone. I believe you can hear me. He wants me to talk louder. I have a big voice. So, welcome, everyone. This is just, we are waiting for, I think, one professor. You see how important one person can be. So as soon as he overcomes the cold weather outside and comes in, we can get started. And we want to make this announcement with my apology for the delayed start to everyone, but particularly for those who are joining us online. We have a number of people already online. We want them to know that we are about to start. They should just hold on wherever they are. I'm seeing people here, Dr. Chinwe Catherine Eze, Federal University of Technology, Owerri, Nigeria. So that's how far we have people. Dr. Toshi Anand, Assistant Professor from Institute of Gandhian Thought and Peace Studies, University of Allahabad, India. So as we are here at UN headquarters, we are joined by people from as far away as Nigeria and India. Bear with us, we will start properly, and thank you for your understanding. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone, Excellencies, distinguished professors and academics, policymakers, distinguished panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Exactly 140 years ago, a group of Europeans gathered in Berlin, and they took one good look at the whole continent of Africa and decided to carve out the continent like a piece of meat on a plate. There was no single African present. None of our chiefs, none of our wise women, none of our royals, none of our wise men, academics, learned people were present. Hello again and welcome to day number one, because the marginalization of African voices hasn't gone away. Whether in the UN Security Council, at the World Bank, at the IMF, or global institutions, decisions have been made about Africans without Africans. And so, welcome to day number one of our three-day academic conference on Africa to address some of these weaknesses, some of these errors, some of these problems. And this conference is organized by the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. It is the second edition that we are kicking off today with the overarching theme, Power, Justice, and the People, Human Rights and the Rule of Law for Africa's Transformation. I don't know about you, but the word transformation for Africa, we can all agree, is something we desperately need. A warm welcome to those of us who have braved the New York cold to be here in Conference Room 2 here at UN headquarters. Let me also say that there are people joining us on UN Web TV online. Others are joining us on YouTube. If you go on YouTube and you just search for Academic Conference on Africa, you will be a part of this live and we shall be together. My name is Ben Dutse Malo. Someone on YouTube has just exposed me as someone he used to listen to on the BBC. So I own up. If you don't like the BBC, I own up. Please forgive me. If I one Namibian diplomat who was an assistant secretary general here confronted me and said, "Are you the one who used to work for that imperialist radio station?" And I said, "Oh, it's me." And then we laughed over it. So I'll be serving as your moderator. Before proceeding further, let me just inform everyone that we are having English and French translations available. And I can assure you that you will definitely need this for the keynote remarks that are coming up in just a moment. So have your earpieces ready. We will also be having subtitles. And again, you may think you don't need them, but I can assure you, you are going to need the subtitles in just a moment. What is the roadmap ahead of us? For the next 3 hours, we are going to have a radical and unusual keynote address by the distinguished Kenyan author and novelist, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This will be followed by a promising panel discussion with 3 distinguished African academics together with the Honorable Chief Justice of Ghana. Then we are ending today's session with a 1-hour interactive dialogue, exchanges with people who are online, people who are here. As you listen through, if there are some questions, some comments, above all, solutions to this issue of Africa and Africa's transformation and the theme we have, please note them down, go on YouTube and put them there. We will read them and we will come back to you. And in this regard, we urge anyone who wishes to raise a question, provoke a small debate, or offer recommendations for Africa's transformation, please get ready, whether in the hall here, Conference Room 2, or for those who are joining online, you will be most welcome. And so now, why are we here? What is our objective? What is the purpose? What are the expectations as we all gather here today and over the next 3 days? There is no one better placed and better equipped to lay the foundations for us going forward than a sister I have the highest regard for. To be a finance minister in any nation is a tough job. But to be in a place where the money is not enough for what needs to be done is another thing. I think you know where I'm going already. And then for that person now to be at the United Nations seeking Africa's transformation, for me, you can't get a more practical person than someone who has grappled with poverty, success, prosperity, and transformation than this great sister of ours. I need you to help me welcome, to address us and give us the opening remarks, the former Finance Minister of Cabo Verde, currently and now the UN Special Advisor on Africa, Under Secretary General Christina Duarte. USG, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Her Excellency, my dear sister Gertrude, Honorable Lady Chief Justice, Judicial Service of Ghana, His Excellency, Ambassador Salam, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs and personal representative of the President to the Arab Republic of Egypt, to Alden Napad, and APRM focal point. Excellencies, distinguished academics, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to welcome you to the 2024 UN Academic Conference on Africa. Together, we gather under an important theme: power, justice, and the people. Human rights and the rule of law for Africa's transformation. This theme is not only timely, but transformative, echoing the focus of this year's annual report of the Secretary General on the promotion of durable peace through sustainable development in Africa. Presented to both the General Assembly and the Security Council, the report shines a necessary light on the state of rule of law and access to justice across Africa. A sobering assessment of how much remains to be done, but also a call to action for innovative solutions. Let us be candid. The report acknowledges that governance failures have hindered justice, human rights, and the rule of law across the continent. Yes, to truly address these issues, we must go beyond technical fixes and open ourselves to a deep exploration of root causes. Some of these causes are anchored in history. One cannot speak, as our moderator mentioned, one cannot speak of Africa's present without recalling events like the Berlin Conference of 140 years ago, a gathering that redefined the continent not as a collection of sovereign states, but as an object of division and exploitation. This colonial legacy creates a void, a foundational absence of the state that remains a root cause of many of Africa's challenges. But let us be clear. While history matters, Africa is not a prisoner of its past. Our discussions must be forward-looking. They must recognize that Africa is not an empty space waiting for external solutions. It is a continent of resilience, agency, and diverse systems of governance. Indeed, we must ask ourselves, how do we ensure that Africa's future is defined by its people, not by external narratives, past or present? One critical area we must explore is the role of customary and informal justice systems. Across vast swaths of Africa, where formal justice systems are either failing or absent, it is these community-based systems that have borne the responsibility of delivering justice, particularly for those who are marginalized, women, rural communities, and the poor. These systems are not relics of the past. They are active mechanisms that bring meaning to justice and the rule of law in ways that resonate deeply with local realities. As we assess Africa's progress, we must do so holistically. Yes, we must evaluate whether formal systems are delivering, but we must also examine what has worked in their absence. Are we valuing the contributions of customary systems enough? Are we learning from the ways they have filled the gaps left by formal governance structures? Over the next 3 days, I implore you to grapple with some fundamental questions. First, how do we decolonize our understanding of justice, human rights, and rule of law in Africa? Are the frameworks we use to measure progress truly fit for purpose, or are they tools of the same systems that have failed Africa for generations? Second, what does justice mean in a context where the state has been absent or ineffective? How can we build a justice system that is both rooted in Africa's realities and resilient enough to serve all its people? Third question, can Africa's customary and informal systems be integrated into a broader framework of governance? Or will they remain overlooked despite their proven track record of delivering for millions? Fourth, what role must African academics play in reshaping the global narratives on human rights and rule of law? How do we ensure that African knowledge not only informs, but leads policymaking? These questions are not just for debate. They are an invitation to rethink and reimagine. And here, I want to end with a message to two critical groups represented here today: policymakers and academics. As we close the gap between theory and action, I urge academics and policymakers to break free of their silos. Far too often, these two communities fail to engage in meaningful, and in doing so, we lose immense value. Policy cannot thrive without the insights of research, and research must find its way into the corridors of power. Let this conference be the beginning of a stronger, more sustained dialogue. Africa's knowledge, its lived experience, its innovative solutions must land powerfully in policymaking. Together, we have the responsibility to make that happen. The Africa we want, it is the Africa the world needs. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, the UN Special Advisor on Africa, Under Secretary General Christina Duarte. Several things she brought up. Africa must not be a prisoner of its past. And one of the famous sayings of Under Secretary General Duarte is we have to move from managing poverty to managing development, managing African success, managing and expecting Africa's transformation. I learn a lot anytime Under Secretary General Duarte speaks with passion. Africa's future must be determined by its people. Veritable statement. Thank you again. Muito obrigado. Okay. So now we are moving to our keynote address by famous author, novelist, the distinguished professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Professor Ngugi was getting ready to be with us here in person, but due to an unexpected emergency, he regrets not being able to join us physically. However, he did everything he could to prepare a recorded keynote, remarks for all of us for our benefit. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is where I'm going to request that you give us your extra attention with your earpieces ready for interpretations, plus your focus on the subtitles that are coming up, because Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o has chosen to do something radical. Unless you are Kenyan and you are Kikuyu, he is going to address us in the African language of Kikuyu. I think it's important that we listen to the sound of the language. I think this speaks to the agenda of the authenticity of Africa in what we are trying to convey this morning. So we need to hear the sound of an African language and appreciate the importance of language in the transformation journey. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Na ke hoto meario e ango adio a kereria mosamanio wetaneto ne United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. Moite tato ginyidano di wadi deba mwakaine wa ngiri igere na mirongo ere na ina. Hari toa kita gongo wa Thiong'o na keweraine ninie distinguished professor wa English na comparative literature University ya California, Irvine. Ninge de mwandiki wa mabuku bereine kana kiambirireine ndandikaga na Kiingeretha no nĩ ndakinyire handũ ngĩtiga kwandĩka na Kiingeretha kana Gĩthũngũ. Rĩu nyandĩka mabuku makwa na makĩria marĩa ma ng'ano cia gwĩtungĩra na Gĩkũyũ, rũthiomi rwa maitũ. No itanambĩrĩria wamba gũcokia ngatho nĩ inyuĩ ngwatanĩro ya thĩ yothe kũhe kamweke gaka njarie ikoniĩ thiomi cia Afrika. Ngwaria ũhoro wa rũthiomi na mũingĩ wa Afrika gũtunywo ma hinya na kĩhoto. Na ngwambĩrĩria na karũgano kandĩke nĩ mwandĩki ũmwe wa kuma Ireland ũrĩa wĩtagwo James Joyce. Mĩaka gakundi nĩndakorereire karũgano kau karĩa gacabithĩtio ngathĩti-inĩ ya Gĩitaliani ĩtagwo Il Piccolo di OSAA ya mweri 16 mweri wa kenda mwaka wa 1907 gataũrĩtwo na Kĩingeretha na getagwo Ireland at the Bar, kana bũrũri wa Ireland igoti-inĩ kana gũcirithio. Othe athitangwo moimĩte gĩcagi kĩmwe mwena wa ithũĩro bũrũri-inĩ ũcio wa Ireland, na othe manyitĩtwo na magathitangwo na thitango ĩkoniĩ gĩkuũ kĩa mũtumia. Ũmwe wa athitangwo acio atano arĩ mũthuri wa mĩaka 60. Mũthuri ũyũ oĩ o Kĩ-Irish tu tondũ nĩruo rwarĩ rũthiomi rwa mũmũciari. Hĩndĩ ĩyo bũrũri ũcio wa Ireland wathagwo nĩ Ngeretha na koguo rũthiomi rwa mawatho kana rwarĩ rwa Kĩingeretha. Koguo mũthuri ũcio na acio angĩ macirithagio na Kĩingeretha, rũthiomi matoĩ. Igoti narĩo rĩahũthagĩra mũtaũri, jaji akarĩ na Gĩthũngũ, mũtaũri agataũra na Kĩ-Irish, nake mũthuri akarĩ na Kĩ-Irish, mũtaũri agataũra na Kĩingeretha. Nake mũthuri ũyũ orio ciũria, orio kana nĩ onire mũtumia ũcio na maitho make. Mũthuri ũcio akaheana rũgano rũnene, nake mũtaũri agataũra ũhoro ũcio wothe na kiugo kĩmwe. Oiga aca, orio kana hihi nĩ arĩ mwena ũcio mũtumia ũcio akĩũragwo. Mũthuri ũcio akaheana rũgano rũnene na Kĩ-Irish, mũtaũri agataũra ũhoro ũcio wothe na kiugo kĩmwe. Aca, mũthuri ũcio atuĩrĩirwo kĩnyonga. Reke twĩcirie hau wega. Mũthuri ũcio nĩwe wathitangĩtwo mũciri na mũcirithio kĩarĩ kĩhoto gĩake kana ma yake kũigua ciugo ciothe cia thitangano ĩyo. No rĩu aracirithio na rũthiomi ataraigua, na koguo gũtirĩ kiugo araigua kana kũmenya nĩgetha ahote gwĩtetera wega. Rũgano rũu rwa mũthuri ũcio rũrarĩ ũhoro wa Afrika na mũingĩ wa Afrika gũtunywo kĩhoto kĩao. Thĩinĩ wa Afrika yothe mawatho mothe makoragwo mandĩkĩtwo na thiomi cia rũraya. Ona watho ũrĩa ũtuĩkaga nĩguo wathaga bũrũri wothe ũrĩ na Gĩthũngũ wĩtagwo constitution, wandĩkĩtwo na rũthiomi rwa Gĩthũngũ, kana nĩ Kĩingeretha, kana nĩ Kĩbaranja, kana nĩ Kĩreno. Na ũguo nĩguo Afrika ĩtũire kuma hĩndĩ ya ũkoronia. Tamenya nĩ kũrĩ irĩkanĩro kana treaty nyingĩ ciĩkagĩrwo kĩrore gatagatĩ-inĩ ka mũkoronia na anene a Afrika a hĩndĩ ĩyo. na ciothe ciarĩ nyandĩke na thiomi cia acio maratunyana bũrũri. Hatirĩ kĩrĩkanĩro ona kĩmwe kĩandĩkagwo na thiomi cia ene bũrũri. Ona twanyita wĩyathi mũtaratara ũcio noguo ũtũire wathaga Afrika nginya ũmũthĩ. Gĩthomo nĩ gĩthũngũ, magoti nĩ gĩthũngũ. Atĩ ona anene a Afrika makĩaria mũingĩ wa bũrũri wao, ona angĩkorwo marakũngũĩra ciĩko cia bũrũri ũcio, mamaragĩria na gĩthũngũ. Ciikaro-inĩ cia thĩ ta United Nations kana ũrũmwe wa mabũrũri, ũrĩ waigua Mũafrika ona ũmwe akĩaria kuo na rũthiomi rwa Afrika? Mũnene kana mũrũgamĩrĩri wa Baranja aiga na Kĩbaranja, wa Ngeretha na Kĩngeretha, wa China na Kĩmandarin, wa Russia na Kĩracia, ũguo o ũguo. Rekei njuge ũndũ ndanoiga na ũrahutia ũhoro wa thiomi cia thĩ, kana cia Rũraya, Amerika, kũrĩa Asia kana kũ. Tondũ to Afrika ici yatunyirwo thiomi ciayo. Kũrĩa guothe kwanathwo na wathani wa ũkoronia, kana nĩ Ireland, kana Wales, Amerika yothe, New Zealand kana Australia, rũgano nĩ rũu rũmwe. Ene bũrũri gũtunywo ithaka na gũtunywo kĩhoto nĩ ũndũ wa gũtunywo rũrĩmĩ. Kiuga atĩrĩrĩ, ũngĩmenya thiomi ciothe cia thĩ na ndũĩ rũthiomi rwa mũciari kana rwa mĩikarĩre yanyu, ũcio nĩ ũkombo wa meciria. No ũngĩmenya rũthiomi rwa mũciari waku, ũcoke wongere thiomi iria ingĩ ciothe cia thĩ, ũcio nĩ hinya wa meciria. Kĩhoto ti kĩhoto angĩkorwo kĩratwarithio na rũthiomi mũndũ ataraigua.
Wow. I was trying to learn a few Kikuyu words. And he says, no African leader comes to the UN to speak an African language. And I started thinking about Kiswahili. He brought the Irish dimension. Somebody's lengthy explanation is just reduced to the word no, one word. And then he says, justice is not justice if it's not delivered in your language. I think that's the way he put it. Our laws are written in non-African languages. Our constitutions, our treaties are written in languages that are maybe European. So a lot of provocation there. We want to thank the distinguished professor, author, and novelist, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for provoking us. I may not be able to say thank you in Kikuyu, but I can say asante sana, which is the nearest from Kiswahili. Thank you very much, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Ladies and gentlemen, I see some people online, and for those of us who are here at UN headquarters, it's important for us to let them know that we hear them and we are with them. We have Mwesigwa Lot from Uganda, El Haji Amadou Sow from Senegal, Mary from the United Kingdom, Dr. Gail Stanback at SUNY Empire University, we see you. We see Abi E. Kamara from Sierra Leone. We have India in the house. Somebody joined us from India. Nigeria is very well represented, not just here in the hall, but also online. We want everybody who is online to know that they are a part of what is going on. I just want to urge everyone during the course of these discussions, anything provocative that comes into your mind, a comment, please take note of it. You can put those comments and views on YouTube and we will relay them. Any question to the panelists who are coming up, we want to do all that. I know somebody's also joined us from here in the US, Florida. We acknowledge you. Kole Odutola from Gainesville, Florida. We acknowledge you. Ladies and gentlemen, today the conference is focusing on rights and realities, integrating diverse dimensions of human rights in Africa. We are now going to have a panel discussion on this sub-theme. We'll be having the Honorable Chief Justice of Ghana, Justice Gertrude Saki Tokonu. We have Professor Chidi Anselm Odin Kalu, and then Professor Penelope Andrews, and leading them, serving as the moderator for the discussion from now till I think 12 noon is going to be Professor Obiora Okafor, who is the moderator. He will give the full introductions. Professor Okafor, Kedu, please take over. Okay. Okay.
Excellencies, Honorable Chief Justice, I'm a lawyer, courtroom lawyer I was, so like I told her, I have to bow anytime I come in contact with her. Distinguished academics here present, distinguished audience. It's really a thing of joy to be here today discussing first the continent and human rights on the continent. As the MC said, panel focuses on rights and realities, how to integrate really Africa into the core, not the margins of human rights, but human rights thought and human rights action. But before I go further, I just want to introduce the panel in a little more detail. Of course, we have the Honorable Justice Gertrude Saki Tokono. I hope the pronunciation is better than Ben pronounced my name. Who's the Chief Justice, Honorable Chief Justice of Ghana. In Nigeria, I would have said my lady first. Before that, as a lawyer myself, we have two old friends of mine, not in terms of their age, in terms of how long I've known them. Professor Penelope Andrews, former Dean of Law at the University of Cape Town, doesn't appear on the program, but I know that. Very distinguished sociolegal scholar, and one of my inspirations, you know, who's now the John Marshall Harlan II Professor of Law and Director of the Racial Justice Project at New York Law School here in New York City. And then my good friend, sometimes co-conspirator, sometimes virtually and actually, Professor Chidi Odinkalo, Professor of Practice in International Human Rights Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, currently chair of the Governing Council of the Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu University in Anambra State of Nigeria, where I come from. Former chair of the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria, and currently, are you still current, chair of the Truth, Justice and Peace Commission of Southeast Nigeria. So really, we have a distinguished panel with us to tackle this very important question. And the premise of the entire panel and the discussion that we hope to generate is that Africa has always, and emphasis always, had a rich tradition of human rights, not merely human dignity, human rights. Discuss, thought, and practice, yet that is often not realized, even among Africans. And I emphasize even among Africans, as my own empirical work shows, even among African human rights activists. This goes unrealized too often, goes unrecognized. The ways in which the lived experiences, the thoughts, the philosophies, the cosmologies of our African peoples have shaped human rights both locally and globally. And I hope this will come out in the discussion. And I'm not just talking of some museumified history that you can go and look at somewhere. I'm talking about a living history, a continuous history that has stretched, a history of struggle that has stretched for centuries, really, in Africa. For example, the women's rights movement in Nigeria, formally speaking, can be dated to 1929. It's not something that was brought to us from Europe. It was actually a struggle against colonial injustice. So that is the premise of the conversation that we hope to have. So just to push that forward very quickly, because we don't have as much time as I would like, I would like to begin from the beginning, really, with Africa's human rights legacy. And turn to my panelists, not my panelists, the panelists, with this premise and then two questions. Our cultures, our thinkers, our practitioners have long embodied and espoused human rights thought, have long practiced human rights from antiquity, from time immemorial. Yet global human rights discourse is often dated, framed, and in my view, limited as something that arose in a particular place, Europe, at a particular time, capitalist European times. Therefore, pushing these experiences of Africa, these thoughts, to the margins. Not that they don't exist, they do. They are mostly eclipsed. Some of it is erased, but it's mostly eclipsed. They are behind a shadow. And this exclusion is not innocent. It reflects certain power imbalances. Imbalances in how knowledge production has proceeded, how discourses have proceeded, who writes about Africa and for Africa, and so on. So why do you think, my first question would be, why do you think this is so? Why have these legacies been eclipsed in this way, if you permit me to use that word? Perhaps I will start with the Honorable Chief Justice, be the proper lawyer.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you to the conveners for inviting me to be part of this discourse. And thank you again to the commencing statements from Her Excellency Duarte and Professor Wathiongo, all of which have provoked a lot of thoughts this morning. Back to your question on why do I think this is so? I believe we have these gaps, perhaps not innocent, but they have been accommodated over these decades and even centuries, maybe because of the inherent tension and the inherent multiplicity of Africa's own legacies. If you take my country, for instance, my country, Ghana, the creation of Ghana as a modern state started with the ceding of sovereignty, so to speak, in the Bond of 1844 by some coastal kingdoms and states. And my own ethnic nation of the Fantis were part of this exercise. And then it pushed further into the middle part of Ghana through war against the Ashantis. By the time the northern part of Ghana, what was the Gold Coast and now Ghana, was added to the national map, the original strategies of pulling in the sovereign will of the peoples there, namely the Hausas, the Dagombas, etc. These are sovereign kingdoms in themselves. The strategy of pulling them in through agreement were resorted to and much easier to implement, like it was with the coastal state. I think the final addition to Ghana as a modern state came from the Ewe Kingdom, or the Ewe Togoland part, and they came in by a plebiscite, by voting after the Second World War. All of this exercise finished in 1956. And by 1957, Ghana had become an independent nation. And so you have all these diverse states, kingdoms, sovereign groups being pulled together in different models and shaped into a nation. And the question then arose, what is our reality of law? What is our reality of justice? What is our reality of national discourse? We began with a constitution, a national constitution, which recognized a place of customary law. And within this framework, of course, our customary identities have never been lost. If you recall, I identified myself as a Fanti. And we have grown the nation around our customary law in layers. We have the Constitution as a national law. We have the statutes passed by Parliament as national law. And then we also recognize our customary laws as part of our common law. So there is the inherent tension, the inherent multiplicity, the inherent diversity, and the issue has always been, how do you create a common thread? And so I think that there has been weakness in the very structure, in the very multiplicity, in the very multiplied, diverse models of law and justice systems within the nation. And though when it comes to the smaller groups, these little enclaves of law have helped to hold us together. And I am quite convinced that the strength of our customary law is one of the reasons why Ghana, for instance, as a nation, has never been subjected to civil war, because we coalesce around our governance systems, our political systems in the ethnic groups, and they are able to provide leadership in times of tension. And so the nation is structurally growing around these many arrangements. So while internally we are having to confront the need to constantly deconstruct and reconstruct, it's more difficult to present one front to the global discourse. And to my mind, these are some of the issues, of course, not all of it, but these are some of the issues that have weakened the strength of voice of Africa. I mean, for instance, when Professor Wathiongo came online and chose to speak Kikuyu, I'm sure there were very, very few in the room who could follow without the English translation. But should we insist on the speaking of mother tongues, how many mother tongues would we have to deal with? So the diversity, multiplicity themselves present an issue that compels a reconstruction. And that reconstruction is an exercise that must be undertaken, I believe, by Africans with clarity, with purpose. And nobody will do that for us. I think we should determine to do it. And then we can better meet the global discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chief Justice. Professor Andrews, can I?
Yes, thank you, and thank you so much for your introductory comments, and I really am pleased to be part of this panel. So I'm going to respond. Your question, why is Africa's human rights legacy largely excluded from mainstream human rights narratives? I'm going to pick up from what the Chief Justice said with respect to diversity and multiplicity and so on, and just unpack this a bit, because Africa's legacy is extremely diverse. And when you think about human rights legacy, whose human rights legacy are we talking about? Because if we think about South Africa, for example, the country that I am most familiar with and write about, so the first thing I want to say is that you just sort of have to unpack this whose legacy, because just a few decades ago, the human rights state that was constructed, South Africa largely, I mean, we know that Mikau Matua and other people, Muna Ndula is here as well, that South Africa really was a purposive human rights state developed in the wake of the 40 years of the United Nations, the Human Rights Charter. So there was a lot of excitement about what was going on in South Africa, and South Africa's constitution, in fact, was seen as the optimal human rights constitution. And so for a long time, I know living in New York for all these decades, the South African Constitution was seen as something that the whole world had contributed to, whether it's Canada, Germany, Kenya, and so on, South Africa. So it was very much central to human rights discourse for some time, I would say from 1994 to the last few years, where there's been quite a bit of disillusionment and so on with the South African project. And I think that's probably what has also happened with the decolonial project in Africa, and I'm being very general here, that the fortunes of Africa, the socioeconomic fortunes of Africa, the realities of the global economic system, the political system, and so on, have all contributed to this marginalization. So it's a huge, complicated discussion around, why mainstream narratives have to a large extent excluded Africa's human rights legacy. But I would say that South Africa is sort of, to some extent, an exception because of a range of things, and we don't have time to go into that as well. The second point is that when we think about the last few decades, I mean, I see, if we think about human rights legacy, you're correct that, for example, you mentioned the Nigerian women's rights movement and so on. I think that when we think about specific parts of human rights, and I think about gender equality, for example, the ANC Women's League in South Africa, the other organizations, women organizations in Africa that have contributed largely to the discourse on gender equality and human rights. And I asked my research assistant just to do a study on women presidents and leaders in Africa, and by far, the continent of Africa outstrips most parts of the globe. She found that as of November last month, Africa had 22 women serve as heads of state of government, either as presidents or prime ministers across 17 different countries. We have difficulty in the United States electing a woman for president. So I think that's just one of the sort of indicators of the human rights. So there's a lot around that as well that I think the contribution has been, and I don't think that the narrative may be marginalized, but in reality, I think that's a consideration as well. And then the third point I want to raise is that if one thinks of human rights and knowledge production and the centers of influence and power, particularly in the wake of the internet and so on, and English as the global lingua franca for human rights, arguably. I mean, people, French people may disagree, and, people in other communities. But I think there's been a lot of saturation of global human rights discourse, particularly in North America and Europe, with African scholars and African policymakers and so on, to a large extent, drawn to the global north, and particularly in the wake of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was this idea, this global rule of law, which was really very largely influenced by the United States. And so a particular economic agenda, a particular vision of the rule of law became the dominant one and the most influential one, and I would argue hegemonic. So that that may also have contributed to the marginalization. So those are just my 3 points as maybe curtain raisers about these questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Right. Thank you so much, Professor Andrews. Professor Dinkan.
Thanks a lot, our moderator, Professor Kafwan. Can I after a Chief Justice has laid down the appreciation to the organizers and to the Undersecretary General, I'm only obliged to say I concur. I'm not even qualified to say I concur. But for this morning, I will claim that privilege to be able to do so. And I'll add 3 things to what's already on the menu on this particular question. And probably in order of chronology, it seems to me that one is colonial anthropology. One issue is colonial anthropology. The second is formation in our schools, in our knowledge centers. And the third, in my view, is the methodology of the academic industry itself, in the intellectual industry. But let me start with colonial anthropology. Quite a few people here, I'm sure, went to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Exactly. And SOAS was set up to and the great thing about this question, in my view, is that narrative is important. And as Africans, we've got to invest in it. As African intellectuals, academics, in the intellectual industry, we've got to work at it. SOAS was actually set up to propagate a colonial narrative, a narrative about the peoples of the rest of the world. And it did that excellently, and which is why SOAS is actually struggling for mission now that much of that industry is ended. Now, and so they went around the world manufacturing fiction about different people whom they could not understand. The first piece of, it's interesting that this morning we've listened to a narration in Kikuyu, because the first authentic piece of African anthropology was facing Mount Kenya, supervised by Professor Malinowski at SOAS. A lot of people don't realize that. And that was done by the man who eventually became Kenya's first president, Mzee. Now, and we have not really done a lot of work in contesting that space of the fictionalized African anthropology. And in the industry now, we say anthropology does not matter, actually. Sociology does not matter. We've actually decapitated the social sciences. And it is in the social sciences that you frame the imagination of people. And when you don't do that in the social sciences, you do it in education, right? So, who discovered Livingston Falls? And who discovered River Niger? And who discovered the source of the Nile? Who discovered Victoria Falls? Who discovered Lake Victoria? Now, kids are taught all of this in our schools till today, that we were discovered by white people, okay? Who came, and the Undersecretary General has said something this morning about Africa not being an empty space waiting to be discovered. And yet our kids are all over the continent today taught about how we were discovered. How do we contest that narrative of our discovery? I think it's up to us to address. So I do think that space of anthropology and the social sciences has been left, we've abdicated substantially, and we've got to redress it. Secondly, you know, I have to confess with considerable shame that I realized more than 25 years after first qualifying as a lawyer that the idea that colony could have left us with an independent judiciary was a stupid lie. Because all of us, there's a Chief Justice here, and she will probably defend with her life the idea of a judicial independence. It makes absolute sense, right? Judicial independence is a great ideal. But no, colonialism did not give us independent judiciary. Because if you just step back and think about it, colony, independent judiciary cannot go together. That means that when we became independent, we did not have independent judiciaries. It was an ideal that we should have fought for, but we were told that we already had it, and therefore we did not have to work for it. And what has that meant? Our independence, our judiciaries have become wasted. And now, why do I say this? Our universities still teach our students across the continent till today that colonialism gave us independent judiciaries. And challenging that formation, that false formation, has to be our objective, and we've got to address it. Thirdly, the industry of academia, the peer review industry, then knocks you back if you want to challenge all of these, particularly if you're looking to do it with the traditional publications, right? Because the people, the gatekeepers of the peer review industry will tell you you are doing haram. Who told you this one? Where's the footnote? And you cite a footnote from an African country, they will tell you that they have never heard that before. And that gatekeeping now, as several of us begin to become senior in that business, we've got to try and address it. And I'm so glad that Professor Ndulo is here, because he's an institution. Professor Zeleza is here. Now, all of these seminal institutions in human form will have to accept the responsibility of beating down those gates and the sentinels at those gates. And the final point about this is about how we balance out narratives of dominance and resistance. There's no story of oppression without a story of resistance. The traditional iconic human rights narratives are narratives of domination. How do we capture the stories of African resistance to that? That's mostly been done by historians, and we've not managed to marry up the normativity of human rights with the memory of history. Let me rest there. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists in your responses to that question. I'm mindful of time because I've been told that we have to sort of end this part of the discussion at noon. But I wanted to say a word or two about this question before moving on to the next one, the next sort of set of questions, which is that one way of understanding all that has been said, really, or rather exemplifying and demonstrating it is, and I know if you're not perhaps an international human rights scholar, this may not be familiar, is to remember when the African Charter on Human and People's Rights was first adopted. If you go back, just go back to the literature, Chidi's already laughing, and look at the reception it received. It was almost like a monstrosity had been birthed. How dare you talk about duties? How dare you talk about people's rights? How dare you talk about economic and social rights? And yes, it had a legally binding right to a healthy environment that took the UN another 30 years to recognize. It already had it in 1981. But the reaction was hostility. So once we think of that, it summarizes everything, right? First, we are not capable of independent thought. And that independent thought, if it comes out, is somehow an abomination. You know, it's something we shouldn't produce. Its entree into the global human rights discourse is always through struggle. So, as Chidi said, some of us have spent 30 years trying to break down those barriers through citation practices and all kinds of gatekeeping that you have in the journals. Some of us decided not to publish in those journals. That's the only way we could get the thing done, right? So the marginalization is real. We're not just, because a lot of times when Africans gather or people concerned of Africa will make this point, it's as if you just want to make trouble, The trouble, it comes from the other side. It comes from the mainstream, in my view, and not necessarily from those who just want to express their lived experience. These things that the global human rights system is beginning to recognize, economic and social rights, duties were in the UDH, but if it's the African Charter, it's a problem. Yes, the Universal Declaration had one provision on duties, language, but even the American Convention does. The European Convention does not. The rights of peoples, well, yes, partly through African work, it was forced into the two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the one on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They talk about the right of peoples in just one provision, in the common Article 1 of those two documents. So I have a ton of things to say, but I'm mindful of time. So I'll go on to the second set of questions. And the premise for that question is that, and this is a good segue from the last point, which is that the African Charter from the get-go exemplifies an effort to reach beyond the traditional narrow, I dare say European, it's not even European, it's liberal, bigger liberal European, because socialism was also European, thinking about human rights, incorporating alongside rights language, duties language, innovating certain human rights entitlements, like the one to a healthy environment, like the right to development, and so on. These were innovations in the African Charter, or at least African Charter improved on some of these things. Against that background, against the historical background of knee-jerk marginalization and containment practices against African thought on human rights, which is founded, like I said, on the lived experiences, understandings, philosophies, and cosmologies of those who wrote these African documents. How can Africa's lived experiences and philosophies enrich human rights understanding? Perhaps I'll give the Honorable Chief Justice a break and begin from the other side, if my lady permits. Okay. Yes, let me start with Professor Dinkallo. How can our lived experiences and philosophies better shape global understandings of human rights?
I see you want to start with the leftists.
You're to my left.
Exactly. Well, I don't know. I'll probably approach this in a fairly illustrative manner. When you think about human rights documentation, the first thing people will look at is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. And it's like, you know, they go to mine privations in order to broadcast them to the world. African privations are broadcast to the world, and of course the story of Amnesty International, the classic story is of the persecution of Agostinho Neto in Portugal, and how that then, you know, started off a letter-writing campaign by Peter Benenson and all of that. So Africa is at the heart of that, but as an object, not a subject. Now, but really, the history of human rights documentation is 120 years old. Where did it start? The Congo. Casement report. Roger Casement did the first human rights report, and it was about King Leopold's predations in the Congo. And it had a seminal impact. The Casement report was, Roger Casement, by the way, was Irish. And he was an Irish consul in the Congo. And he documented the destruction of the Congo and the decimation of his population, real time. Roger Casement was a queer. And of course, the Brits killed him. They executed him in the heart of the First World War, accusing him of treason. And the reason was a mix of issues that will not detain us here. But the work he did with the Casement report and the pioneering of human rights documentation, nobody has documented. Why? Because he was marginal. It was African by an Irish who was queer and who was killed for treason. And Roger Casement would never have been killed if he wasn't queer or Irish or both. Now, how many Africans know about the Casement report? I bet if we took a poll in this room, very few would know about it. How many Africans know that as a result of, it was the Casement report that led to effectively the toppling of King Leopold in 1908. And that is how Belgium undertook a constitutional reform that transformed the monarchy from the king of the Belgians to king of Belgium, constitutionalized the monarchy of Belgium. It was the Casement report. It was the Congo. And it is significant, entirely accidental, that yesterday the court in Belgium upheld the claims of 4 African women against Belgium for violations during the Belgian occupation of the Congo. It seems to me that what we do need is a different kind of lens, a lens that is not intellectually or morally independent. Is not intellectually or morally dependent on these framings that we were given from our teachers who, sadly, were victims themselves of the colonial narratives. And in ending this segment, let me also underscore the point that I do recognize that there is some contest over the terrain of coloniality and decoloniality. The debate between our keynote speaker today and my compatriot Olufemi Taiwo, who is also teaching somewhere here in New York. But it seems to me that that debate can take place within a framework that liberates our minds from the kinds of framings that have been handed to us and looks at our sociological and historical experiences and offers us a contextualized interpretation. Can I yield, please?
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to just use a sort of circuitous route to come to answer your question by just saying 2 things, and I want to refer back to the remarks of the Undersecretary General this morning when she said Africa must not be a prisoner of its past. So for me, the story of human rights as a human rights lawyer, the story starts with the establishment of the United Nations and the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there's a whole lot of history before then. But from my perspective, the modern human rights movement starts there with all its complications, with all its contradictions, dishonesties, and so on. And I want to say, well, you take the story from there, then the story of African participation is one of both agency and marginalization, because the input of African governments in the major international human rights instruments, including the Declaration Against the Crime of Apartheid, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, all these major international documents, sort of reflects the input of Global South African countries, Nigeria and India particularly. So it's a mixed story. The narrative is not just one of oppression. It is about some kind of empowerment and agency, but also in the context of marginalization. It's always been it's sort of complicated. So to come to the African Union, I sort of see the African Union and particularly the African Charter to some extent in the same way that one sees the development of the European Union and the European Charter in global bodies, the inter-American bodies as well, and so on. And that is about the uniqueness, the particular way that human rights is both seen and has arisen in Africa, not just as individual rights, but as group rights, as the rights of peoples, and the focus on social and economic rights. So that to me is a story of empowerment. It's, but it's also, again, full of contradictions. The African Charter of People and Human Rights has been implemented and enforced on some levels, but not. And Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe posed a huge challenge to the African Union and the Charter. So I think that you see the political questions and so on that impact on that. But I do think that the Charter, the African Union, with respect to get back again to gender equality, their initiatives have been groundbreaking and pioneering, and is central in the sort of human rights discourse around gender equality. So yeah, so I think that, you know, telling the story of the African Union, it's a story of both success and the Charter as well, but it's also of you know, disappointments and so on. And then the final thing I want to say is, and here to look at the African Union and the South African Constitution as well. The South African Constitution embodies both social and economic rights. And it's a great constitution as a document. But the reality of South Africa is that it's a deeply unequal society. The political and economic choices that the government has made, and particularly the widespread corruption of the last decade or so, has meant the continuous impoverishment and inequality, so that the document stands almost like that it doesn't have any meaning. It's a document that is not being enforced at a real level. So I think that's also part of the tensions of the reality of people's lives, the economic and political choices, and what a document can do. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd have loved to begin by responding to the provocation on judicial independence, but let me leave it. But I think that I'd like to focus on the lived experience angle for someone who has to deal with what people are going through on a daily basis and what they need resolution about, and then move that thought around economic and social rights as a part of human rights, and then move it into the bigger ripple of people's rights, and see about laying a line through these three layers. And I'd like to begin from land rights, for instance. Within the capital, equity, wealth creation, conversation in the market and in communities, one would find economic rights as something that really lie in personal rights. However, within African experience, African lived experience, and I'm speaking with my eyes on Ghanaian communities, land is held by families, land is held by stools, land is held by clans, and these community-held assets are managed by chiefs. These chiefs have multi-obligations First, multi-roles, roles. First, there are governors, there are rulers, and there's an imperial construct around that. And then there are priests, and there are fathers, and so there's a guardianship construct around that. And then they are given trusteeship rights over these lands, and so there are legal constructs around that. And so within these layers, the citizens who actually own the lands are unable to find their way. And so what should have become primary resource and primary sources of capital and equity for the citizen is dissipated without the citizen having a stronghold a stronghold in law to make a claim to that right. And it is only in the context of people's rights that one can see a way clear out of this maze and of this deprivation. So when you talk about economic and social rights being part of human rights, that is a reality. However, how do you move that reality into actuality? And when there isn't a legal framework for that movement from reality into actuality, it is easier for the deprivation to keep going on and on and on and on. And that brings me back to the point I made, that this is a critical junction for us to deconstruct what customary law means to us. What the entire conversation of customary law being part of the common law of African countries or of the legality around which law is arranged or injustice is arranged for African societies. How do we formalize, for want of a better word, formalize rights and entitlements from these sources into national life? I'll give you an example. Even the determination of who owns the rights in, let's say, my part of the world, Fantiland, or where my father comes from, where my mother comes from, who owns that has become a legal and factual question. Is it a matrilineal society? Is it a patrilineal society? And if it's a matrilineal society, where do I make my claims from? In the maze of all of that, I leave it. I leave the question. And somebody else sells the land and makes it his pocket money. And so consistently, whether it's a matter of an investor, whether it's a matter of a citizen, whether it's a matter of an external investor, even state appropriating land, very, very, very critical questions are difficult to answer because those who should be interested in answering them are those who are not interested in answering them. So, with all the work that the academics love to do, and for those of us who have to manage the lived experience of citizens, I think it's so critical for us to find concepts, conceptualizations, constructs of law within the discussion of what it means to be an African subject to customary law. And those arrangements that deal with our political, our economic, our social rights that are structured as human rights. What does it mean? What do we do with it? And then we'll be better equipped to deal with the world. This is my view. Thank you.
Thanks for the well-deserved applause for the panelists. I'll chime in as usual with my 2 cents very quickly before we move on to the last set of questions. For me, at a conceptual level, first and foremost, the challenge is one of recovering our agency, right? We did not consent necessarily to our agency being taken. It was taken. not completely, but taken significantly, right? It continues to be exercised at a macro level, not necessarily in our capitals, right? And for me, this is also reflected in our academics. That is not to erase or eclipse the agency on a quotidian, daily basis that Africans exercise, but on the macro, not micro, level, the framing is not done by us, right? For me, this historical moment is an excellent opportunity. It's a moment of what the Chinese scholar Ming Wan has described as the new Cold Peace, right? If you look at the last Cold Peace or war, that was when Africans, there's a book that just came out, excellent book, I recommend it to everybody, that shows how much Africans shaped international law in that moment. We have to seize this moment because it's not just about our leaders going to Russia and then tomorrow they're in China, and it's about us as scholars, as practitioners, knowing that this is a moment where our ideas can actually, we have greater room for maneuver because the two new superpowers are caught in Africa, right? So there is an opportunity politically, there is an opportunity intellectually to again infuse a lot of ideas. People think, the struggles of the 70s were complete failures. They are not. That book, which is a book in international history by Umut Otsu at Carleton University in Canada, is a must read. It gives in 300 pages, in close detail, how much, again with the Irish, the very, very resonant things, the support of notably the Irish and a few European countries, allies, how Africans put their stamp on international law. So we need to recover our agency. Another is on the part of the world that's listening out there. There needs to be greater epistemic humility. Okay? If you are not humbled by the fact that it took you 30 years to recognize a right to a healthy environment when Africans had it in 1981, right? You should be humbled by the fact that we're now talking about a binding treaty on the right to development. 40 or so years after two Senegalese scholars literally invented the idea, right? So Africans can think. Africans have always thought, and Africans have good ideas. There should be greater receptivity on the global plane. It should not take resistance. It should not take people, some people say, we're not going to publish in these journals at whatever risk for that to happen. We have independent ideas, and those ideas deserve a fair hearing. Very quickly, the battle for economic and social rights on the conceptual plane is largely won. As the Chief Justice said, the battle is more about implementation. I think the South Africans have led on implementation. They have shown how a constitutionally guaranteed economic and social rights can be implemented. They have shown the world how it's done. Okay, I can list all the cases. That's what I do. I don't have anything to do on weekends, so that's what I do. I read all the South African Constitutional Court cases on economic and social rights, from Subramuni to all the case treatment action and all that. Brilliant cases. Read them. I recommend it to the world. Read them more. Yes, Professor Andrews, people know, but we don't know enough yet about them. People, not me, but people generally don't know enough about these things in the detail. Also, the story we tell about origins matters for the president, the origins of human rights. It matters for the president. The fact that we don't root human rights in struggles against apartheid, we don't root it normally. People like you and I do, but most international human rights scholars don't do that. We don't root it in struggles against colonialism. We have a now famous international human rights lawyer who has actually argued that the anti-colonial struggle was not a human rights struggle, right? And he's famous for arguing that, Samuel Moy. Yes, I will say the name. Okay? So, and I'm not talking 100 years ago, I'm talking a few years ago. So the fact that we don't root it in the struggles against slavery is indicative of what we think are human rights, of who we think are human, right? Never in history has everyone been included in the concept of human. Make no mistakes. It's just rhetorical flourish. In the living human rights law, the concept of human has always been partial. Are you getting it? So we need to recover no less than our humanity, and it cannot come but with struggle. Epistemic, activist, Chidi has done both, Penny has done both epistemic and activist struggle. And lastly, just a quick illustration before I move on. On the day it was adopted, the European Convention on Human Rights scarcely had any economic or social rights provision, maybe one. On the day it was adopted, no one knows it all, right? No one or people or region knows it all. It took several amendments. In a paper I gave in Leiden in January this year, I empirically demonstrated it to the Europeans, right? This is why you need to be humble. This is why you need to hearken to the lived experience of others who instinctively, because of their lived experience, know that the right to food is a human right. Right? That's what we're talking about, that the right to housing is a human right. You don't need to teach that to my grandmother. She knows that, right? So these things are important. So I'll move on to the last set of questions, regrettably. We don't have so much time. I think we may have to get 10 more minutes because we started so late. Thank you so much. So African institutions, like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Banjul, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, based in Arusha, and the ECOWAS Court, for example, based in Abuja, Nigeria, have often led in advancing human rights jurisprudence. Despite these significant contributions, these bodies tend to be underappreciated in global human rights discourse. Based on this premise, how can the contributions of African human rights institutions and frameworks, and shall I add even of our courts, like the domestic courts, like the South African Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Ghana, and so on, be more effectively acknowledged and integrated in global human rights praxis? To what extent do these bodies, international bodies such as the UN, engage with Africa's human rights innovations? And here I would appreciate examples if you have any. And then we can't close the panel without asking, how can Africa and Africans address post-colonial misrule? I know it's a big question to do in the 20, or these are big questions to tackle in the 20 minutes that we have, but I trust your sagacity and concision. Shall we start perhaps with the Honorable Chief Justice? If everybody can have 5 minutes, what am I doing?
I hope I don't need more than 1 minute. Thank you. I think that going back to the Berlin Conference, there is an opportunity given us as Africans now to unpack what people's rights mean. Unpack it, structure it, present it to ourselves, to the world, and present it for implementation within our nations, because the cry around injustice is as deep within the countries as it is within our international relations. Much of the time, the conversation is addressed to injustice around political and civil rights. And a lot of the jurisprudence, for instance, from my country, has, in our constitutional jurisdiction, has been to address those political and civil rights. The right to vote, the right to be registered to vote, etc., the right to assembly, the right to expression, the right to privacy. But as already intimated this morning, when the economics are not right, you will not have a people who are settled, a people who feel stable, a people who feel empowered to be able to answer. And when there is no legal construct for responding to the injustice, then the turmoil gets worse and worse. And so I think that we have a perfect opportunity now to go back to the Berlin Conference and say, this is who we are. We are made up of different states and kingdoms within these artificial arrangements. These are our legal systems. Our legal systems need to be properly described, understood, clarified, recorded, and structured to accommodate each other with the view, the extremely focused view of where we want to go as a nation and as a continent. It's not enough to have the AFTCA secretariat, trade between here and there. It's not enough to imagine that that answers the economic question, because the fundamentals are really within human rights questions, people's rights, questions around people's rights that are not being answered. And so to go back to these international courts within Africa, the court in Arusha, the ECOWAS court, etc., you will discover that much of the work done even is on whether the court has jurisdiction to answer or to adjudicate a particular question, or it should be sent back to the domestic court, etc. On a technical level, there may be some resolutions, but a lot of effort is wasted. A lot of effort is wasted, and that may also be the reason why I mean, as Chief Justice of an ECOWAS country, I sit on the Judicial Council of the ECOWAS Court, and so I'm speaking from the viewpoint of someone who has to deal with some of these issues. I think that we have to give to ourselves the opportunity to unpack what people's rights mean, to create legal constructs for them, deliberately discuss them, deliberately agree on them, and deliberately implement them with the focus of ensuring peace, stability, and prosperity on the continent. That's my view.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chief Justice. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Andrews?
Yes, so your question, how can the contributions of African human rights institutions and frameworks be more effectively acknowledged and integrated globally? So the sort of a modest answer that I have to that question is that who are the actors who make this possible? So we do have institutions and rules and laws and constitutions and so on, but everything depends on people to make that possible. So I think that I have a very hopeful approach on this one. There are huge numbers of African scholars globally. In fact, the statistic is that there are more African academics living outside of Africa than inside, with respect to major research institutions and so on. So I think that can be acknowledged, and we have people who have done it. So it's a very modest thing, but the individuals do make a difference, I think. And so that is a way to acknowledge and integrate. So, for example, I teach international human rights law, and most of my course is about the judgments of the South African Constitutional Court, because they embrace international human rights law. The second is also international bodies engaging with human rights innovations. I want to go back to the individuals as well, and I'm thinking here of Secretary General Kofi Annan, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who sort of, there were a few other Secretary Generals. If we think about the United Nations as the preeminent human rights organization, I think that there was engagement, even though there were, disappointments, and again, not everything could be done, but there was certainly hopeful moments then with African innovations and Africans' contribution to human rights. Then the third question, how can Africa address post-colonial governance challenges using a human rights perspective? And I think I concur here with the Chief Justice that to a large extent, African governments have, generalizing here, have disappointed their populace. The promises of the post-colonial society and the post-apartheid society in South Africa, governments have failed on many, many levels. And so the emphasis and the strength comes from civil society organizations holding governments accountable. So I think that civil society and individuals have a huge responsibility to hold governments accountable. And they can do so in a messy way, like the hashtag Roads Must Fall and hashtag Fees Must Fall movements in South Africa and in other ways as well. I'm thinking here, for example, of the Arab Spring, which didn't go the way we thought. But the reality is that it's individuals who are outside of government who have a huge responsibility to hold government accountable because, as I said, there's been huge waves of disappointment with governance in Africa. And again, it's a general statement I'm making there, but I think that's my contribution. Thanks.
I was waiting for the applause.
Oh. You didn't have to wait.
Professor Dikalu.
Thank you very much. Let me, I hear the point about us being, the need for us to be forward-looking, and I would prefer to be very persuaded by that, but you can't go forward without your memory. And if you're saying we should be recovering our memory, the question is, which one takes priority? So the idea of going forward, I hear it, but I refuse to forget the past. And this is part of our African problem. The Jewish nation is chasing people who are in their deathbed over crimes of Holocaust. Africans will tell you, forget. It is this business of refusing to remember and viciously refusing to remember that keeps us where we are. So I refuse to look forward, Madam Undersecretary General, without vigorously interrogating the past. Listen, in June 1918, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council handed down a venal decision, Southern Rhodesia. I read that thing every week, and sometimes I read it and I cry. It said on page 233, 1919 appeal cases. The report starts at page 212, but on page 233, some tribes are so low in the scale of civilization that their rules do not matter. That is who we are. We were trash, and as trash, we were treated. DRC had over 60% of its population liquidated. And you're telling me to go forward. Go where? No, I refuse. And I think it is important that we say this with venom. And unless you do so, and you invite me to come here and go forward, I will tell you, no. This thing is life and death. What are we teaching our children? That it is okay for us to be liquidated without consequences. And you see what is happening. Because people are now beginning to remember consequences are happening. So you have the case Ndiki Mutua, 2012, in the United Kingdom. right, fought in the courts in London because the women of Mau Mau decided to recover memory. And the government in the United Kingdom had destroyed the records. And these women said no. They took their broken bodies there. And what happened? When the government failed on jurisdictional grounds, they negotiated a settlement. You're seeing that with the cases coming from Zambia, going to the courts in the United Kingdom. You're seeing cases from Namibia. And then we sit down here as privileged Africans and tell ourselves, go forward. Please refuse that message. The second thing, and this is where historians and lawyers must work together. The history has been forgotten, and we have not made the teaching of history central to the learning of law. And I do think we are in a position to redress that and redress it brutally. There is no way you can teach law responsibly without going back to history. I teach international human rights law. And you know the interesting thing, you do the time mapping. U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776. French Revolution, 1789. When was Haitian Revolution? 3 years later. But nobody teaches you about Haitian Revolution. So I start my human rights law class with a class on the Haitian Revolution. And it is revolutionary. It is absolutely revolutionary. I teach Americans history of Haitian Revolution. The Americans have never heard of it. And so it transforms their understanding of human rights. And I challenge those of us who teach human rights here, please start reading history. They buried everything in history. And because lawyers teach normativity as law, without narrative deconstruction of the law, you are teaching nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And I really would persuade every one of us here, and I'll end on this note. If you want to understand the incapacity of Africa, there's no way you cannot go back to the League of Nations Covenant. Go and read Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant. It describes us as people unable to survive in the realities of modern civilization. It is in black and white, paragraph 3 of Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant. That is who we are. Now, that legal incapacitation started with Southern Rhodesia. And so if you don't unearth this narrative, how are you going to go forward? If you were actually legally incapacitated, legally infantilized, and then liquidated. And because we were liquidated, liquidation continued. Because by the time we became independent, we had already been habituated to being liquidated. How do you end it without understanding that you have to break that psychology of being at home with liquidation? And that is the note on which I end. 1, partnership with historians. 2, partnerships between those at home and the diaspora. And 3, partnerships with clinical psychologists. Because the intergenerational trauma of accepting liquidation continues to live with us. Can I end there?
Can I hear more wows in the room? Music to my ears. When you background what should be foregrounded, you create a false picture. That's my summary of what he has said. Mm-hmm. We have put into the deep background what should be in the foreground and create a false picture, of lack. Yesterday, Madam USG told us, Africa, and I'll be harsher, about $500 billion per year is stolen from Africa. Yes. Look at what was happening for 60 or 70 years in Niger with their uranium. That is stealing. Okay? You can't be paying them $1 for what they should get, $500 for. These are technologies. Okay? The first thing Magufuli, who, by the way, opposed on civil and political rights, but was excellent on economic and social rights. The first thing he did before he died in Tanzania was literally to build fences around all the mines. You know why? The gold and diamond was literally being carted away. right? So this is important that we put these things in the foreground so that this talk of extending aid gets reframed. If you're taking 500 billion out, you're not giving us aid, right? This is attributed to Madam Undersecretary General, okay? And to others before her. So this is very important, the points that have been made here, that we can walk and chew gum. Moving forward does not require forgetting. Right? We can walk and chew gum. It does not require, indeed, forgetting is central because, not forgetting, remembering is central. Because the liquidation continues. As my brother Chidon Kalu put it, the liquidation continues. It hasn't ended. It's an unbroken chain. It's an unbroken history. Lastly, I just want to, in the spirit of presence, not absence, Africa has, not lacks. Okay? We both lack and have, but we have more than we lack. If you look at the African court, and my very good friend Pacific Zia worked on this case when he was on the African Commission. If you look at the Endorois case, read it. The Endorois decision, it's a flagship, highly innovative case. It teaches the world how to apply people's rights. Okay? This was repeated a few years later in the Ogiek case, both of them from Kenya. Okay? Very detailed, excellent decisions. At the Human Rights Council, Africans have led on so many human rights issues. First, in reframing them as human rights issues to begin with, because that's the first battle. What I've just talked about 500 billion per annum being taken from Africa in illicit financial flows, is a human rights issue. I worked on that when I was on the Human Rights Council's Advisory Committee. We reframed that as a human rights issue, of course, against the usual opposition. Racial injustice in the US. The Europeans, the Americans came together to tell us that it was not a matter for the Human Rights Council. Well, my good friend Tendai Achume, who was Special Rapporteur on racism, aligned with African states, emphasis states, right? Aligned with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, fought valiantly by the US. They wanted a special rapporteur to be appointed to investigate racism and police brutality in the US, which everybody knows is an epidemic, literally. But of course, power shapes, and a compromise had to be struck, which is that we now have a new global mechanism, not one on the US. Of course, the US is exceptional, like some other countries to whom human rights does not apply, at least global human rights. So the Africans are waging these battles, sometimes under the table, because we are not highlighting them. So I wanted to provide, I could go on till tomorrow morning. Do you have time? To give you examples, because I participated in these battles. So Africans are waging these battles. They are creating human rights norms. They are fighting power. Power often wins, but sometimes Africans succeed. And that's a story of agency that I want to leave us with. With due respect to the MC for taking another 10 minutes, like a Nigerian. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Dalu, for those of us who don't speak Kikuyu, or the Kikuyu version of Nigeria, Dalu is the Igbo word for thank you. And I, even though I'm a Ghanaian, I get easily mistaken for an Igbo, so I've had to learn some Igbo words. We want to say thank you to Professor Obiora Okafor, Professor Penelope Andrews, and then the agent provocateur. I don't know the Igbo word for him, Professor Odin Kalu. Chief Justice, you are the moderating influence. You speak and then we calm down. We want to thank everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an opportunity over the next 40 minutes to hear anything that provoked you. I heard many things here. How do Africans address post-colonial misrule? This is very relevant. I was hearing Professor Odin Kalu mention Mungo Park, David Livingstone, and all those so-called discoverers of places in Africa. And in actual fact, a few years ago, a Ugandan brother who lectures here in New York went to London and on Facebook declared himself an explorer who discovered the River Thames and renamed the River Thames as River Gulu, Gulu being his hometown in northern Uganda. So there is a counter-narrative that we are also going to Europe to discover them and give them names. So there are all these aspects. We've got a lot of questions from YouTube, and we have questions here in the House. Professor Okafor, the questions in the House, I think you should take care of them so that I can focus on the ones that are online. From YouTube, we have, even from India, we have people from Ethiopia. There are many questions. Jonelle Ferguson is saying something, Professor Okafor, that you touched on. Economic rights of Africa hinge upon the continent's deeply rooted and continued exploitation. Much pressure is put on African nations to repay the loans that they borrow from the West. Yet, the Western nations have acquired billions from exploiting the people of Africa. And it is not propaganda when Undersecretary General Christina Duarte mentions that every year, as we are seated here, December, by the end of this year, $500 billion, at least, through illicit financial flows are taken from the continent. And yet we go to the Western nations to ask for pittance. How can this be addressed? That is the question from Jonelle Ferguson. I don't know which of our panelists can address this issue, that African rights are rooted, or the denial of African rights is rooted with the continued exploitation of the continent and the continent's people. How do we stop these illicit financial flows, 500 billion every year, and ensure the rights of people? A second question, just to get us going. So, Professor Okafor, you direct us to who among your colleagues should answer this. Several questions brought an intersection of human rights, technology, development, and transformation. We have a professor from the University of Rajasthan in India who is saying, how do we decolonize when we are grappling with the digital divide on the African continent? He goes on to say, how can we use technology to ensure and guarantee human rights? How can the access to internet as a technology enable human rights for Africa and Africans, especially during periods or times of censorship and political division? So, two separate questions. $500 billion is taken out of the continent every year. How do we stop this as a right for African people? Number two, how do we use technology right now to address issues of the digital divide, or using technology to overcome periods of censorship and political division?
So, Professor Andrews wants to address the first one.
Yes, I'm not a financial expert with respect to the financial flows out of Africa, but let me just say from the limited knowledge that I do have, that there are a few questions that need to be asked first is, are we talking about contemporary flows or are we talking about historical? Contemporary or historical. If it's contemporary, then the second question is who is permitting, who are the actors who are engaged in this widespread theft? Because there are particular corporations, institutions, individuals, so that's the second question that you have to ask. And then the third is that there are, even though they may not be very powerful or maybe may not be as effective as we'd like them to be, there are bodies that deal with corruption and transparency and so on that really are trying to address this question about massive exploitation on this scale. So also, are we talking about corruption? Or are we talking about just the general kind of profiteering that happens under the name of global capitalism and so on? So I think these are very, very difficult questions, but I do think they're possible, even though there are very limited ways to do them. But you have to go to the heart of the matter and find the root cause and then try and address ways to address it. I hope that sort of contributes to the answer a bit.
Before I return to the rest of the panel, I'd like to call on USG Duarte to intervene. Yeah.
Can I?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to jump in the conversation, just to provide a clarification. And I take the opportunity to mention, to quote, one of our flagship reports of 2023 that basically presents, from an analytical standpoint, the triple paradox that has captured Africa in the past, I would say, 60 years. And the first paradox is the financing paradox, where basically we say that Africa loses $500 billion, and I will provide the breakdown, loses $500 billion on an annual basis. But at the same time, this same continent, our continent, is in debt distress and sometimes begging for ODA. And this is a paradox that we need to address. The $500 billion, and we, in that report, that I can ask my team to send the link to everybody that is participating in this conference. In that report, we present the breakdown of the $500 billion. It's not only corruption. No. In fact, if Professor Penelope, if you read the UNCTAD report of 2020 about Africa's illicit financial flows, only 5% are due to corruption. Only 5%. I know that every time we mention Africa is losing money, we tend just to blame corruption. Corruption, no. We need to go in detail to the numbers, because the question is much more complicated and label corruption for everything that happens in Africa. And the breakdown is $89 billion is illicit financial flows out of the 500, $89 billion. In the $89 billion, the breakdown, 65% is trade mispricing. Niger example, you just mentioned in this. Trade mispricing, meaning that every time Africa exports, every time Africa imports, we are cheated. As simple as that. Trade mispricing is a much nicer word. But if you squeeze the lemon, it's cheating. But also within this $500 billion is not only stolen money. Illicit financial flows, 89. But Africa loses 79, I would like to repeat, $79 billion on an annual basis on inefficient public spending. Inefficient public spending. There is an ADB report, I think from 2018, that says basically that every $10 that a national budget allocates to the education sector, only $2 reach the school. It's written. So inefficient public spending is a huge challenge in terms of Africa's control of its economic and financial flows. But also, within this $500 billion, you have $46 billion on inefficient tax exemptions. We believe, from a policy-making standpoint, that attributing exemptions, fiscal exemptions, tax exemptions, will attract foreign direct investment. This is a myth. And in fact, Africa loses $46 billion in inefficient tax exemptions. Then we go to pensions funds. Pensions funds, by definition, by default, are source of long-term capital. Where are Africans' institutional pension funds? Not invest in Africa, not financing Africa's development, but placed outside Africa. This is losing money from a financial standpoint. And as we speak, pensions funds, Africans' pensions funds liquidity is around $1.3 trillion. Let's assume that we claim only 10% of debt to finance Africa's development. So we have a missed opportunity on an annual basis of $130 billion. If we go to carbon markets, the missed opportunity is around $100 billion. And I would close responding to my now dear friend, Professor Kiji. I agree with you. In fact, in my remarks, I say, history does matter. But we need to process history looking forward. As an African, I need to stop losing money. And I will use my memories, my history, to address Africa's future challenges. Sometimes, and allow me to speak in this conference as an African. Personally, I have taken a decision. Professor Kidi, stop blaming and stop begging. Why I'm wasting time in blaming and begging? I'm losing. I'm losing. When we close our business today, COB today, after we have lost $1.4 billion only today. So I agree with you, Professor, we cannot move forward erasing the past history. This is crazy because the moment we erase the past, we erase memory, we lose ourselves. Once you lose ourselves, you cannot address the future challenges. But what I'm saying, let's do that intentionally, that the next 60 years will be dramatically different from the past 6 years. And we need to control, Africa needs to control its own economic and financial flows. I cannot have countries that have no money for education, no money for health, no money for energy, no money for water, and that same country loses millions of dollars in trade mispricing. We need to understand the missing piece in this equation. And this is the reason that in my open remarks, I mention in a very subtle way the concept of absence of the state. Strong country systems, strong institutions, made in African institutions, and I'll stop here. My apologies for taking too much time.
Thank you so much, Madam USG. Seeing that we have barely 20 minutes for the rest of the conversation, we're going to take a few questions. Please limit them to questions, and please limit your interventions to 1 minute, please, at most 1.5, please, so that we can take all the questions, and then we'll have a last round of interventions from the panel. I'm going to call on the person seated in seat 427. 427?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I am Queen Mother. I'm the community mayor of Harlem and an ambassador of goodwill to Africa, and have been around the United Nations for about 55 years as a humanitarian. But I am so moved to be in this room today with you at the age of 83. It warms my heart that this conversation is taking place. So Queen Mother will continue to join you every day and to hear from you and what is the plan for Mother Africa as she sit and wait as the world feed upon her nurturing body, and in her belly, everything we think of is there. So Queen Mother, thank you for allowing me to address you. I thank you.
Thank you for keeping to time and being exemplary. The person seated in seat 381. 381, yes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Rosemond Yeboah, and a youth representative for the New Future Foundation, headed by Queen Mother Dr. Deloise Blakely, and I'm also an alumni for Baruch College City University of New York. So my question is pretty much simple, and I will appreciate if Professor Chidi can also add his voice to my question. So I would like to find out from our panelists, what do you suggest and recommend that international students, with which majority of people are from Africa, look into in terms of practical research areas that they can do in social science areas? And how do you also suggest that we can bridge the gap that has got to do with gatekeeping and publication, just like Professor Chidi said? So recommendations on and strategies as to areas that we can look into for research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Person seated in 408. 408.
Thank you very much. I'm quite impressed by the high-level, discussion from the panel. My name is Alejone Abebe. I work for UNHCR here in New York, and I'm challenged by this presentation on a number of levels. One, I'm a parent, and I'm always struggling to have a discussion with young men, and who often blame the past, how they're brought up, always complain about the parents, but also having a discussion to help children, young men and women, to assume responsibility. And I think much of what's happening in our continent, I'm from Ethiopia, of course, history matters, but history is also not everything. And what are those issues where we need to assume and raise young men and women in Africa to say we are responsible? And in the area of displacement, for example, the risk that I see in this kind of argument is it's risks valorizing traditions and customs where we see some of our own African customs don't protect the rights of women or people with different sexual orientation, or these concepts are imagined as non-Africans or some. This is one area. The other is when we invest so much in Africa on history, we also tend to ignore the agency of people. To what extent we should assume that responsibility. In the area of, for example, refugee protection, we see lots of innovation in Africa. Africa has innovative legal standards protecting internal displaced or African refugees, and the vast majority of Africans refugees are actually hosted by Africa. But at the same time, there are challenges. To what extent we should apportion history to blame and our leadership and ourselves, around our institutions. And the last is really, especially the concept of, I mean, if you can react to this, the concept of indigeneity and like tribes and ethnic configuration, and for example, and the concept of citizenship. For example, in a country where we want internally displaced people to return to an area, they will be not allowed to return because that's not your area. So how does this conflict with the notion of citizenship? Thank you.
Thank you so much. The person seated in 337. No? Okay. 435. Seat 435.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Sambu Diakite from the Office of the High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island States. There were a few mentions of injustices against Africans and governments promoting human rights understanding in local languages. But the real question for me is how can our countries be effectively held accountable when rule of law and human rights enshrined in our laws are not respected, let alone injustices committed by Africans against other Africans? Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for that exemplary approach. 464.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ada Obi Eboka. I'm from Nigeria, and my question is, so first, thank you for the wonderful panel and the great insights that have come out of this discussion today. I just wondered, many of us are from the nonprofit sector and human rights sector in the room, and we're really thinking about, so what practical action points can we think about? I've heard Professor Chidi talk about partnership with historians and all that, and I hear a lot about writing, which I know a lot of African groups are coming together now to produce a lot of history and write-ups. What else can we do? What practical action points can we leave here with? For the international organizations in the room, and for the lawyers in the room, what practical action points? Thank you.
Thank you so much. 464. Yes. No, again, yeah.
States, individuals, institutions, treaties, agreements, all these are matters of law. In this context, how do you propose we recover African agency in situations where Africans do not have authority to control the structures in which we find ourselves in? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Were you 467 or 464? I wasn't sure. You don't know? 419. No, not 419. 467. 467, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Michael Martinez. I'm from Brooklyn College City, University of New York, or CUNY. Thank you to the panel for presenting today. And I love what Professor Odenkalu's mentioning that narratives must be invested. So my question is for him, but for all of the panel. And of course, there's an ongoing debate about what the term indigenous peoples means in a post-colonial Africa. And I want to be sensitive in phrasing this question, but in light of this debate, I'm thinking of recognized distinct minority peoples living in their traditional lands. For example, the Republic of Congo recognized these distinct peoples in their law in 2010. So some distinct groups across the continent in Africa and even in the Americas rely on colonial law to maintain being able to remain and to work and benefit in their traditional lands without interference. So is there an ongoing addition of these narratives in order to decolonize law and constitutions across Africa? And what do you believe is a way forward for the inclusion and investment of minority people's narratives in post-colonial African law, academia, and even academic, political and economic participation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. 523, 523.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hi, over here. Hello, hi, my name is Zoe Marie Mongbet Lamar. I am a graduate student at NYU, and I was also very lucky to be invited here by the African Graduate Student Association at NYU. Professor Odikalu, you said something that really resonated with me. It was that you asked that we not be you asked not to move forward. When in the way you had said that, I think as a young person, you said not to move forward without there being consequences for government's actions. As a young person who will soon be in a position of power, what my question is, and even to the panel, how do you want young people, young African students like myself, to move forward while also not staying within our anger and our upset, within like lack of consequences for these organizations that have power? I really resonated with everything that the panel had shared today, so thank you so much, but that was really my main question.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tala Osman. I'm a Sudanese international student doing my master's in international development at the American University in Washington, D.C. I, like everybody else, really appreciated today's panel. And I wanted to address something Chief Justice Tokolo specifically spoke about. You spoke about the importance of identifying and building systems of legal rights for Africans. There was also collective discussion about not forgetting but still choosing to move on from a colonial grip on legal systems. My question is, how important is it to ensure that the basis of these systems be created independent of input or influence? I know a lot of systems, especially colonial systems, are influenced by colonization, and so I'm wondering how we can, if it's important to ensure that these systems are completely independent, or if there is room for influence that does not harm these systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, the last question we'll be able to accommodate is from the person seated in 432. 432. Yeah.
Thank you, moderator. Let me introduce myself. My name is Farida, and I am from the Permanent Mission of Algeria. It seems like maybe I'm the only one representing the member states. So if you allow to bring some political insights and perspective to this very rich discussion. And I will not miss this opportunity to thank Madam Cristina Duarte and OSAA office who always organize this kind of very, very rich discussions. And also thanking all the panelists. We have learned a lot from you. And your experience has been given us very, very important informations. But I'll say to Mr. Chidi, if I am pronouncing well, your name, that I can't agree more with you. I think in your last intervention you have said it all. We should not forget the past. I fully agree with you. And while we move forward, we should interrogate our past, because we cannot only keep looking for economic profit, but there is what we call the dignity also. We should keep living in dignity while we follow and look for our objectives in all different domains, economic and different fields. We think that the situation today is a consequence of colonialism and historical injustices. And this is a very important point that I felt that every panelist has tried to address it, but it was not really clearly highlighted. We are living historical injustices. Look at the discrimination and racism that a lot of Africans in Africa and outside Africa, they are still living and enduring. The absence of Africa from the world economy and international trade, we are behind. Why is this gap between the North and the South? Because we don't have the mechanisms, we don't have the tools, because at certain point when this economic system was being built at international level, Africa was still under occupation and colonialism. Also, the lack of resources, I addressed this point, and also the absence of Africa from the decision making. That's a very important point. The peace and the future of Africa are subject to sometimes arbitrary decisions at the UN or at the Security Council. Why is this situation? Why should we be the consequence of other parties' decision making? Why don't we join this platform and be able to decide of our destiny in equal foot with other international players? That's a very important point. And I think all those issues I am raising here, they find their roots in that historical injustice, whether it was colonialism, whether it was slavery, that all related. So I always agree with Madam Cristina Duarte, but today she will allow me to say something different from her. Yes, it's very important to look forward, but our past as continent our continent lives in very specific situation. And I think we should take into account those specificities of Africa. And I think she always do it when she addresses us as member states. So I agree with her in some of her points. When she talks about the loss of between 500 and 600 billions every year when it comes to the tax and some part of corruption, that she has addressed it. My second point, and I will stop here, is to also emphasize the idea that has been reflected by Madame Penelope. We have a cornerstone in Africa, which is the Charter of Human Rights and Peoples. That's very specific to find the peoples reflected in the title. It's a uniqueness for Africa. And that reflects the rich culture and authenticity of the African identity and the peoples of Africa. And when we consider these diverse dimensions of human rights, that's the Charter of African Human Rights and the Peoples. It offers this distinguished and unparalleled characteristics because it guarantees the rights of individuals, but also the rights of peoples. And I think it says it very clearly in its Article 20, the importance of collective rights, notably the right to self-determination, which is clearly reflected in the African Charter for Human Rights and Peoples, is one of those, let me say, those kind of rights that belong to the peoples collectively. And then Yes, I am concluding by saying also the Charter of the African Union on Human Rights and People has also a beautiful article, which is Article 19, which says, all peoples are equal in dignity and rights. Nothing can justify the domination of one people by another. I will finish by those beautiful words of the African Charter on Human Rights and Peoples. I thank you, moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, distinguished representative of the state of Algeria. We don't have much time because the MC has informed me that he needs some time at the end. and microphones will go off at one. So seeing that, I'm going to just give a short, rapid response interventions of 2 minutes each to just key points, keywords to the distinguished panelists, perhaps starting with the Honorable Chief Justice, please, 2 minutes each. We're really on the ropes here.
Thank you. So clearly there is a need for an African project, a project in which we appreciate that divided we fall, united we stand. And academics and policymakers must come together in the same room as we have found ourselves today. I think the UN is this is a good start. This is a good platform, because usually you would find academics on one side and policymakers away, and there's a general suspicion of policymakers as a place for corruption. But I think that when you put us all together, you will get all the necessary sound bites for to interrogate and analyze and to bring together the models for going forward. On the question of what should be looked at, I recommend research on the psychology of groups regarding rights, strategies for combating economic depletion, and also the need for getting to know each other much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Chief Justice. Professor Dinkalu.
Thank you very much. And can I please apologize to all the questioners? But the great thing is that the meeting has just started. We are not going to exhaust all the questions on the first day, otherwise there will be no second day. And in that spirit, can I just do this? Madam Undersecretary General has moved a motion that we should stop begging and we should stop blaming and use the past to address the future. Can I, with leave of the moderator, suggest a slight amendment to that motion? That we should stop begging and we should start blaming. Because going to the future means claiming. And claiming means blaming somebody. Because when you have to claim, it's like constructing a sentence. You need a subject, you need an object, and you need a predicate. That requires blaming. And as Africans, in order to claim, we have to start blaming somebody for where we are. Whether it's our governments, or whether it is the past, or people who acted in the past, if you don't hold somebody responsible, you cannot claim effectively. Thank you.
And I just want to make a slight adjustment to that motion by addressing my Ethiopian brother's question about moving forward without staying. So we can have a blame. I tell my students, a blaming moment is very, very important, but it's also a learning moment, so that it's looking at the culprit and the problem and then trying to resolve it. So I think in the spirit of the under SG, we're talking about blaming and finding the root cause of the problem, but moving forward. And young people are very impatient, my experience, with history. So you're sort of dealing, I totally agree with you. We've got to know our history. But I find it very difficult in teaching law, for example. We teach history all the time. But I see a certain impatience with young people. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that we can't go into. And then finally, I wanted to just say this. There's so many very valuable questions here that we can't answer. But I'm hoping as this ends, the news has just come that President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa will be taking on the chairmanship of the G20 nations. Maybe he can, knowing the history, move forward and do something positive. Thank you.
Well, I have a lot to say, but I won't, so that my Ghanaian brother moderator will not be upset with me. And just all that remains is to thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Let's put our hands together for the distinguished panel. I want to thank everyone who is here in this hall. You've made this session very productive. Those who are joining us online, either via UN Web TV or via YouTube, we are grateful to you. Ladies and gentlemen, this whole productive, energizing discussion continues tomorrow, 10 o'clock here. Tomorrow, Wednesday, the 4th of December, the theme is going to be historical contexts and contemporary challenges. The evolution of the rule of law in Africa. I think somebody mentioned young people being impatient with history. Tell all the young people you know to be here tomorrow with their impatience. Tomorrow we're going to have Professor Muna Ndulo, who will be moderating. We have him here. We have Professor Zenande Boyd, also here. We have Chief Mary Late. We have Justice Professor Joel Mwaura Ngugi, not Wathiongo. We have His Excellency Ashraf Swelam, and then Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, we are back here, and we want to engage and learn more from this. On behalf of the Special Advisor on Africa, on behalf of her office, I want to thank every one of our distinguished panelists. Let's put our hands together once more. Chief Justice Gertrude Saki Tokonu of Ghana. It's a privilege for me to be here with you. The connections are deep. Professor Obiora Okafor, I am your long-lost Igbo brother. Madam Professor Penelope Andrews, thank you very much. Siabonga. And then I think I should move a motion to have Undersecretary General Duarte and Professor Chidi Odikanlu, we leave them in this room, and then we go away and let them trash out where we should leave the forgetting and where we should leave the blaming. But we want to say a big thank you to everyone. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you, and see you.